Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV. This is UnHerd.com's attempt at a pop-up TV channel during the government lockdown period and this coronavirus era. We are all stuck in our various homes all about the place, but that doesn't stop us thinking. And in fact, people seem to be doing a lot of big thinking during this period, and we are trying to publish some of those ideas on UnHerd. So we, during the next few weeks, and hopefully it is a few weeks, will be talking to contributors and editors and members of our wider editorial group. Just going to silence that. About the big ideas and about what this all means. I am lucky and happy that we are being joined today, first of all by Tom Chivers, who is our very own science correspondent. You don't mind me calling you that, really?
No, that's fine. That's as good a name as any. Carry on.
Expert who published a piece that has been very widely read this morning about how infectious and deadly the coronavirus is or isn't. So we'll be diving into some of that with Tom. We're also joined by Louise Perry, who published a piece about sexual violence on UnHerd this morning. And we'll be discussing that with her, and also joined by Rowan Pelling, who is another writer, journalist, author, broadcaster, and I have to mention, former editor of the Erotic Review. So we'll be coming to them later on. First of all, Tom.
Yes.
Can you hear me and do you read me?
I can hear you. Well, there's nothing to read, but yes, I can see you fine. So yeah, carry on.
So, look, the reason that tens of thousands of people have already been reading your piece since it was published this morning is it is the question everyone wants to know at the moment. You know, how bad is the coronavirus, basically? You know, how deadly is it? And how frightened should each of us be as individuals? And what are our chances of survival if we catch it? So what you did in your piece is look into the various different studies and the difficulties of trying to assess that with this quite patchy and imperfect information. At the end of that, having done all of that work and that research, what was your mood? What was your kind of conclusion about the nature of the virus?
Okay, so I should say I'm really wary about my own mood, because I am this really, I can sense it in myself all the time that I'm this sort of natural optimist about everything. I just constantly assume everything will be all right. And so paradoxically, with this situation, with this, with the modelling of this, the more people who have already had this disease, who have currently got it, the better it is, because that means the fewer people will have died of it, which means that it's a less deadly disease. So I got to the end of this, and you can see the possibilities are that it's infected, a couple of million people already, of which quite a fairly large number have died, of which and more will be expected to die soon, and that's quite bad. Or it's infected, tens of millions, and almost none of them have died, and that works out, comparatively quite well. And I can just feel myself sort of thinking, oh, it's probably the 20 million figure, it's probably everything's gonna be fine. And so I would ask everyone very carefully to pay no attention whatsoever to my mood, which is generally just this sort of ridiculously upbeat thing. I would, however, say that the sort of best estimate, or the central estimate that most people seem to be talking about, is a sort of case fatality ratio of about 1%, or I should say infection fatality ratio, which is like how likely, if any random person gets the disease, about 1 in 100 of them will die. So about 1% of them will die. That seems to be what most modelers are going with, and that would imply that there have probably been about 2 million cases in the country so far, or something like that. Anyway, so I think what I think the correct status to be is very worried, much more worried than you would be about things like flu, especially if you're older and more vulnerable. For most of us, the personal risk will probably be quite low, but for some sections of society, I think, regardless of my mood, the safest bet is quite high.
But if we just leave the mood to one side and look at the actual bounds, then I mean, what your piece did is say that, as far as I can sort of worked out, there's a kind of roundabout sort of 1% infectious fatality rate is on the negative end of the estimate.
Yeah.
And that some of the estimates are as low as 0.26 or even 0.1%.
Yeah.
So is that fair?
Yeah, so that is true. So that's from the centre of Oxford Centre. I'm sorry, Eddie, Freddie, I talked right over you there. But so this Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine looked at the outputs from places like Iceland, which had done quite a lot of testing, the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which everyone was tested on board, and then looked at sort of in these sort of constrained areas, looked at how many people had tested, looked at how many of those people then died, and then tried from there to extrapolate a sort of sensible. Okay, so I should say there's a difference between the case fatality rate, which is how many cases there have been, and then the number of deaths there were, and then the infection fatality rate, which is how many people have actually had the disease. And of course, because not everyone has been tested, the number of confirmed cases will be loads lower than the true infection rate. But anyway, so what we're trying to work out is how many people have had the disease, how many of them have then died, and that gives you your infection fatality ratio. That's really hard to do because of this problem that not many people have been tested, and also because the number of people who died will be about how many people had the disease about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, not how many people have got it now. So you're really struggling to get these really dodgy numbers that are really hard to work out. And yes, some people have had stabs at doing this. The Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine has done all this, taken these figures and come out with somewhere between 0.1% and 0.26%, which seems very optimistic to me. And I kind of hope that is the close thing. The Imperial College numbers, they operate on the assumption of 1%, which is significantly higher and would suggest that we've still got a long way to go.
So I mean, we talk about 0.1% being at the very optimistic end.
Yeah.
If everyone was to get it in the United Kingdom, a country of 60 million people, 0.1% would be 60,000, I think. Is that correct?
Yes. No, you're quite right. 1 in 1,000, 60,000, yeah.
60,000. And if the Imperial College model is correct and it's nearer 1%, that would be nearer 600,000.
Yes.
So even the sort of optimistic doesn't sound that great.
No, but you need to be, I mean, the trouble is you need to be really cold-eyed about this stuff. I mean, in a country of 70 million people, roughly speaking, you'll expect about 1 million deaths a year, roughly speaking, so over the course of the year, this would be, and especially since they'll be concentrated amongst the elderly and people with various background health problems, a lot of them will be deaths that are sort of brought forward by a few weeks or months rather than, I remember I was speaking to one scientist who said, one of the deaths that's recorded was a guy who was 105. And, what was the quote the guy said to me? He was like, I don't know the fellow, but I don't imagine he had all that many years left, right? So a way of looking at this is, which I sort of wish we did more of, and which Toby Young has done a rather clumsy, but I can see where he's going with it, thing, was we talked about things like quality adjusted life years, QALYs, and sort of talk about how many years of life are lost rather than how many actual lives. But that gets into a whole extra layer of complication, which we probably haven't got time for here.
Well, that sort of route starts sounding very sort of cold-blooded. And
it is, but we have to be cold-blooded because when we're talking about these things, in the end, decisions are going to have to be made. How much are we willing to and the NHS does this all the time, that we are willing to spend X £1,000 a year, I think about £30,000 per quality adjusted life year gained for a new cancer drug. If your cancer drug costs more than that, then they won't buy it. And that means lots of people who would otherwise have lived will die. But if you didn't do that, then other people who would be able to afford kidney dialysis or something will live. We have to make these trade-offs, and that is what it's doing.
So on the kind of central question of how many people are going to die from this, basically, which is sort of where we started. I mean, even on the best case scenario, it seems like we're headed towards tens of thousands of people who will die with coronavirus. Is that, we had 500 and something just announced in the past 24 hours. Should we be getting used to that idea that, this is going to claim that many lives? Or do you think, do you think we should be careful about even those daily numbers that come in, treating them as sort of deaths of coronavirus, because some of them might be dying from other things and just happen to be having coronavirus at that time.
Yes, well, that's really key. It's really hard to know which of these people are dying of coronavirus and which are dying with coronavirus. I mean, I just saw this as a sort of anecdote from a Spanish doctor or something like that, saying that someone who died in a road traffic accident and then was tested positive for coronavirus was counted as a coronavirus death because he was tested positive, right? And that's the criteria. That is very unlikely to make a serious dent to the statistics if it's even real, but that's the sort of illustrative thing. And with flu deaths every year, this is exactly the thing. But the problem is that lots of people who have, COPD or some other long-term disease that's making them ill, and then they get flu and then they die. Is it the flu or is it the COPD or whatever that killed them? It's always a bit hard to tell, and what they tend to look at is how many excess deaths there were over a period and use a statistical estimate for that. And we will be able to do that for coronavirus in a year's time or something. But at the moment, it's all so up and it's so hit and miss and so sort of fast moving that we can't.
The idea of excess deaths,
yeah,
which I tweeted about, and lots of people sort of piled in and said that I must have got it wrong. I've been looking at that chart that was in an earlier piece of yours, which is updated weekly from the Office of National Statistics. How many people died compared to how many people you would expect to die in that week? And every week since mid-January of 2020, significantly fewer people than you would expect have died. So we've had a good year, in terms of like numbers of deaths so far. And I just observed that a tipping point, if that's what it turns out to be, was crossed in the latest set of figures, in that for the first time since the start of the crisis, more people died, even though very, very slightly more than you would expect. Do you think that's a legitimate way of looking at it? Like in 4 weeks' time or 8 weeks' time, should we look at, because that's the ultimate way of cancelling out all the variables, isn't it?
And that's what if you look at the European Monitoring of Mortality website, which I think I linked to, I know I linked to in the latest piece, that does show that, and it's I think it's 10 days or 2 weeks behind, but in all the countries in Europe apart from Italy, the level of deaths was about normal for what you'd expect in the period. And in the end, that will be what we look at. Having said that, they will be almost all the countries will go above it. What will be interesting is whether they go above it for the year, particularly, because if lots of deaths are just being brought forward by a few weeks or months, then that will be obviously tragic. But it's not the same as loads of young people dying. That's a very sort of very different thing, I think, emotionally. But the problem is, of course, if you speak to David Spiegelhalter, who's one of the statisticians I spoke to in the piece, what he says is that basically, you can sort of look at the coronavirus risk quite sort of simply, which is that basically if you get it, you have about a year's worth of risk of death crammed into a few weeks. And for those of us who are relatively young and healthy, the risk of dying this year is extremely low. So the risk of dying of coronavirus in the next few weeks is very low. But if you are in your 80s or 90s, the risk of death in any given year suddenly goes up higher. If you've got background health problems, it suddenly goes up very high. And so suddenly you're getting huge risk of dying in a few short weeks. And then suddenly you get a whole year's worth of NHS patients of very ill people crammed into the NHS all at once in the space of a few weeks, like getting, when you get a month's worth of rain in a day, even though we're used to getting that much rain most of the time, it causes floods, right? It's that exact equivalent. And so that is the problem. Even if it is I should say, very much in inverted commas, just bringing these deaths forward from later in the year, it could still hugely overwhelm the NHS. And then loads of people who'd otherwise need ICU beds and get them and therefore recover from what they were going, from whatever, road traffic accident, whatever they are involved in, would otherwise be fine, or at least would recover, now won't, because they won't be able to get their space in hospitals. And that is where a lot of the excess problems will come from as well.
So let's just, as a kind of final thought here, let's think about the end game for this in terms of how we can get out of lockdown, basically. Yeah. This concept of herd immunity has now been sort of poisoned and is now this sort of unbelievably controversial topic. I doubt you will see a single politician in the whole world mention that favorably ever again. But it sort of seems to me from what your piece was saying that whether it turns out that 5% of the population or 3% or 10% or 20 or 30 currently have it, and that number is only going to grow, when we get these serological tests that show who has had it and who is therefore immune, a whole chunk of society is then theoretically going to be released back, it will be
society.
Yeah, there will be a sort of a new caste system between the kind of those people who have had the disease and those people who haven't. And as that proportion grows, all of the young and healthy people are going to want to be in the group that have had it. So it's going to be very hard to get them to be observing a lot of social distancing. And so my reading of the kind of societal reality is that we're going to head in a herd immunity direction, whether the politicians want it or not, ultimately.
Well, yeah, there was an epidemiologist on Channel 4 News, I think, a few weeks ago, having an argument with some guy off a tech company for some reason. I never did understand why. But he was saying basically with an outbreak like this, there are two options. One of them is literally get rid of every single case in the world, just so isolate everyone, and so that there are no cases of the disease left. Otherwise, if you can't do that, and we obviously can't now because it's far too out, the genie is far too far out the bottle, you're going to need to get herd immunity. It's going to have to end up being herd immunity of some kind. Now, the thing is, normally when we talk about herd immunity, we talk about vaccines. So, and it may well be that we're
not going to wait a year and a half
in total isolation, but you might remember that the one imperial modelling paper that came out, the one modelling non-pharmaceutical interventions, and that was the one that suggested actually, when we look at the numbers, it's going to be massively overwhelm the NHS and all sort of things. What they have suggested, and I would be amazed if this isn't pretty directly influencing government policy, is a sort of trigger system. When the number of cases in the ICU reaches a certain point, then they trigger all various like lockdown things, school closures, lockdowns, quarantines, and then you wait a few weeks while the cases drop and the number of ICU beds being in use drops, and hopefully deaths drop. And when they drop below another number, the numbers I think were 60 ICU beds for turning things on, then 100 ICU beds in use for turning them off again. I don't know if it's changed since. When it drops below that number, then they slowly lift some of the sanctions, let people out a bit.
I mean, that sounds to me like the sort of thing that makes sense to a scientist or someone looking at a spreadsheet. And then, you try bringing sanctions on and off, and try and persuade people not to get fatigued and bored of them, basically. And it's going to be so difficult.
It is. I mean, it's going to have to be for a year or more. I mean, and it will be extremely difficult. It may be that it just completely collapses, and that would be obviously bad. But that's, I think, is the sort of or at least was the implied thing. I don't know how it would end up in practice and what things they would bring back, and whether you start letting people just go to the park with their kids a bit or something like that, or if they. But like I've got 2 kids under the age of 7, and keeping them in the house until September when the next year starts, I can't see that happening realistically.
It's not even a political reality; it's just a reality of life that life will carry on one way or the other.
Finds a way, as they say in Jurassic Park. Yeah, exactly. I don't know how it's going to end up, but it's going to have to be something like that. They're going to have to be some relaxing of the rules from time to time, I suspect. Otherwise, we'll all go completely mental.
Tom, thank you so much for talking us through that. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we are now going to move to Louise and Rowan. Hello, guys. Louise, let's start with you, if we could. It's a very different topic to what we just talked about. Although, if I can kind of do a slightly awkward segue, it is true that since YouPorn has done this big kind of PR stunt of lifting subscription for people who are under lockdown in Italy, and so it is the pornography and that whole topic has sort of become involved in this crisis. But let's talk about what you were arguing in your piece. Essentially, as I read it, and please correct me, the sense was that the great kind of liberalizing moment of the 1960s and onwards, which was all about freedom and lack of kind of restraint, in some sense has liberated people, and particularly women, and in other senses has not. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. It's complicated, right? In the way that all huge social phenomena are complicated. So there have absolutely been huge advantages that women in particular, and all of us, have reaped from the sexual revolution in terms of reduction in homophobia, less stigma attached to single mothers, all sorts of things that I would never ever want us to go back on. But I think the view I'm trying to push in the piece is having a more nuanced view, and recognise that progress is not linear, and there are certain benefits that we've gained from the sexual revolution, but there have also been certain costs, and that also this has been an ongoing process. And one of the big shifts that we've seen just within the last 20 years or so has been the rise of online porn, which has just totally changed the game, because the type of porn that we're now routinely seeing, the age at which children and teenagers are seeing porn has plummeted. And it's one of those things that's quite difficult to pin down firmly. It's hard to point at porn and say this, and this has been the obvious consequence, because it's maybe too early to know. It's so difficult to separate correlation from causation.
It's also, Louise, it's also hard to talk about, isn't it? I mean, it's like, I feel that we've gone so far in the liberal direction that kind of virtue is basically associated with all things freeing. It's the shrugging off the restrictive rules and the disciplinarian and being your own true self and so on. So even to talk about pornography in a way that seems kind of censorious, a lot of people's ears pick up and they start thinking, oh, are you going to be a sort of Christian moralist at me, or are you going to, trying to bring us back to the 1950s is always the phrase. So I think that's why it was so important that what you had to say, to try and find a language to talk about the excesses of it without people tuning out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in some ways we don't have the moral vocabulary always to talk about something like porn without reverting to Christian conservatism or some sort of traditionalist desire to go back to the 1950s, as you say. And I think that we need to start having that conversation, even though it is difficult. And I feel as though we are starting to get to that point, because the harms of the porn industry are becoming too apparent to ignore. And there is now an increasing scrutiny of, for instance, Pornhub and the umbrella organisation that owns Pornhub, as well as lots of other porn sites, who do things like, as you were saying at the beginning, offering free subscription services to people in Italy and all sorts of other sort of seemingly philanthropic gestures. Part of the reason they're doing that is because they're facing increasing scrutiny for their failure to remove images of child abuse from their website, and their failure to properly scrutinise sex trafficking, which is filmed and shared and profited from on their website. So
one statistic that really leapt out at me is that, according to a recent study, 88% of the most popular scenes from a particular group of porn sites were violent in some way. So, clearly violence in pornography is not just a kind of niche thing that we don't need to worry about, and we say, oh, it's some sort of kink thing that is not relevant to lots of people. It seems that it has entered the mainstream, and our kids are going to be growing up watching it. It will affect their whole view of sexuality. I mean, if that's true, what on earth can we do about it?
I think sometimes we get trapped into this problem when discussing this, of being very either or about the correlation causation issue with porn, because a lot of porn is violent. Porn has become increasingly violent as it's gone online and has proliferated, and that doesn't necessarily mean that porn producers are responding to demand, right? There is clearly some market for really violent porn. So it's not as though that porn has entirely obviously hasn't created the problem of sexual violence, but it also hasn't.
Market, I think, Louise. I mean,
Sorry, say again?
That market, should that be a legitimate market? I mean, just because there's a market for it, should that market be satisfied?
And also thinking about the extent to which porn might take someone who has some interest in seeing violent sex depicted, but it might be quite a niche, a small interest, but it embeds it, it proliferates it, it feeds this. We know that there are addictive, porn has an addictive capacity in terms of stimulating the brain, rewarding it through orgasm, does have an effect long term. So we need to be thinking about this not just as porn entirely creating violence or porn being entirely innocent or whatever, but thinking more about the ways in which it potentially develops existing problems within the desires of a subset of men.
Let's bring in Rowan now. Rowan Pelling, what did you make of Louise's piece this morning? I mean, do you think we need to be careful here?
I really enjoyed the piece. I thought it was a really good, thoughtful expression of something that we need to say, which is there is now a culture that is more saturated than the culture I grew up in terms of sexual violence and acts that when I was young, they would have been very restricted. They would have been X-rated, quite hard to uncover. And now they're only a click away. So while I'm very liberal in many ways, I don't actually feel that you should have a culture in which you have sort of unrestricted viewing of any form of sexuality, however violent, and not regulate that. We do have to regulate it. And also, I've got 2 sons, so I have a very legitimate concern that I want to bring them up as responsible adults who, engage with women or men in a, totally respectful way that they also have pace to develop their tastes and desires.
I mean, can I ask, Rowan, you said we should regulate, and I would agree with that. Why not just ban? I mean, it's a genuine question. Why should there be a sort of publicly licensed market for violent pornography?
Well, I think you should ban it depending on the type of violence. I actually have a very dear friend who's number 2 on the British Board of Film Classification and Censorship, and who flies in from a European country once a month to watch hardcore porn. So I have some idea of what they're looking at and what they're thinking about. And these are, these aren't, the stereotype of being a sort of killjoy Mary Whitehouse type personality. Those are not the people who are deciding these things, and they are seeing, stuff that I think we would find very hard to even conceptualize because it's so hardcore. So yeah, of course, clearly there are bans on some material, but it still leaks in. And I think we're all wondering about the genie on the internet, how we contain it and how we legislate for it and how we protect children. I mean, there are definite balances to be maintained here between protecting people, but also ensuring that adults, consenting adults can make legitimate choices in terms of what they do, what they watch, what material is made. And, almost everyone I speak to has a different idea, by the way, about what is, unacceptable. We don't all agree on this. And yeah, I mean, it's a very tiny part of the legislation, but when the laws were tightened up recently, in terms of pornography, one of the strictures was that you couldn't show female ejaculation. Now, we all know that porn absolutely depends on male ejaculation, but suddenly that became a kind of obscenity. So although it sounds trivial, there are actually areas within this where you sort of go, why on earth would something that women experience as part of your sexuality, why would that be repressed? and something else made legitimate. So there are debates to be had.
Rowan, do you think whether, despite the importance of, obviously not reversing the gains of liberalism and not sort of going back to some stigmatized culture where any kind of kinkiness is frowned upon, do you think we've gone too far? And do you think, the current set of rules, society, do you think we need to be clamped down or tighten up restrictions on porn?
I think we probably do, actually, and I think we need a very good debate about it, and we shouldn't put power in the porn barons' hands. I would also like to see a real discussion about what feminist porn is, what female-orientated pleasure looks like in that way. I think you don't get a very good idea of that. Most porn is generic, boring, violent, exploitative. But that doesn't mean that you can't have good explicit pornography, because I've seen it, and you can. So it's quite an expert panel you're going to have making those decisions. But yeah, I don't see why you can't legislate.
Let's bring in Louise again. So if we accept that there is a problem, and we collectively think as a society that something should be done about it, you get to the difficulty, I think, which is in whose name do you make that judgment? If there are these very personal and subtle differences, kind of outrageous, ultra-violent things, I think would be almost uniformly agreed on should not be allowed. But you end up having something akin to a censorship system where someone has to be empowered with making a decision about what's allowed and what's not. And we're so uncomfortable with that. In a way, it was easier in the 1950s, because at least, or the 1850s, because there was a sort of, agreed set of morals that everyone could defer to, whilst that now is gone and it's entirely subjective. So Louise, if we're going to fix it, who can do it? Who has enough credibility in the public mind not to be dismissed as a censor?
It's so difficult. I mean, even if we decided that we did want to severely restrict porn, actually being able to do it is obviously such a huge challenge, which the government found, of course, in their recent efforts to try and put age limits on porn, which has all fallen by the wayside for now. I think that it's worth remembering that we do already restrict, for instance, child porn, right? Even though we don't do it very effectively, even though obviously there are all sorts of child porn is easily available. There are very many offenders who get away with consuming it. We do have that boundary in place, and
you mean the same kind of system could be used and should be used for adult porn?
I mean, I would never want to impose that on all adult porn, and I totally agree with Rowan about something like female ejaculation is not top of my priority list, right, when it comes to pushing back against sexual violence. But there is so much, thinking something about strangulation, right, which is a hugely common trope in porn now, so much more so than it was even 10 years ago. I work for a campaign group which documents cases where women have been killed or seriously injured, mostly through strangulation, by men who claim that they consented to it. And we've heard from so many women talking about the normalization of strangulation, the way that really young teenagers have been exposed to images of it on platforms like Instagram, not necessarily actual porn sites. So strangulation is a crime, right? So it's not as though we would have to be rewriting all of our moral values in order to start saying that actually sexualized depictions of criminal behavior is a line in the sand for us, So I think that I would kind of want to see this as a hierarchy of concerns. Female ejaculation is very far down the list. Top of the list would be existing horrendous images, which I think practically everyone would look at and think this is not something that we want to be encouraging in our society.
How bad? I mean, you made a joke in your piece saying that you're 28 and that would classify you as a MILF.
It's true, over 25s now. Yeah.
How much worse has this got in even the younger generations than you, do you think? I mean, what is the scale of the problem now amongst teens? I mean, do you have any knowledge of that?
I hear anecdotally that it is very much worse for people just a little bit younger than me, because I think so much of it is to do with having access to porn privately from a young age, because I still just about remember the time when people didn't have internet, the rest of your family, so it wasn't possible to have private access to porn from a young age. Whereas now, of course, it is, because everyone has it on their phones and they've got it in schools. I used to do consent workshops in my old job and go into schools and talk to adolescents and teenagers about consent and about porn. And there is this feeling of just fighting a losing battle, because you get there and they're already 15, 16, and they've been watching incredibly hardcore images of violent sex for 5 years or something like that, and just feels like this really demoralizing task.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds to me like this is a huge problem, and it seems, frankly, like an emergency. If what you're saying is true, that all of those young teens are already being exposed to this in number. If we're a responsible society, we shouldn't allow that. Rowan, let's get a concluding thought from you.
I would just say that there's an awful lot of teenagers in my extended family, and I talk about sex with them, and it's amazing actually how little difference there is between their generation, that we feel every teenage girl is being forced into a sort of... I actually see quite little evidence. My kids are at big state schools, and it was just in magazines when I was at school. In fact, we found a whole load of porn mag. I did go on to a career in erotica. I mean, what really interests me is how much can sort of, there's actually really, really quite a lot of agreement in this argument. I would very much doubt that Louise and I have any serious areas where we're going to go, no, I completely disagree with you. So, yeah, we could both be censors making this, they're so good at evading responsibility online. There's a ghost company behind a ghost company for the people putting out the worst material. And this is why it's so hard to police. But, on the reassuring side, and Tom's already invoked him, David Spiegelhalter wrote a book about sex, not a vast amount of actual hard evidence that the amount of pornography that is saturated into our society, that it's actually, you can actually see a tracked correlation between that and large scale physical violence. However, emotionally, and as it's a bad thing for our society.
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely fascinating. You have been watching Lockdown TV. This is the UnHerd pop-up TV channel during the lockdown era. We just had some great conversations, and we will be returning to these and many more topics in days to come. Tune in at 4 p.m. live on unheard.com. Thanks for watching.